Typically, I'm sure many of you know, the rise of mass incarceration in the United States is chronicled as a new chapter in the long and unfinished Black freedom struggle in the United States. First, there are plantations, and then there was Jim Crow, and now there's the new Jim Crow, or mass incarceration. I agree 100% with this historical understanding of mass incarceration in the United States. But what I want to do here with you all today is present another optic on this history. I want to anchor my arguments and my claims about what's at play in our nation's jails, our prisons, and our detention centers by speaking a little bit about my new book, City of Inmates: Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles. Now, about 8 years ago, I began researching the history of incarceration in Los Angeles, and I did so for a couple of reasons. First, some of you may know that, in fact, Los Angeles operates the largest jail system on earth, making Los Angeles the city of angels, in fact, the city of inmates, the carceral capital of the world. So if we're going to understand mass incarceration, we got to bring it home to understand it in and from Los Angeles. Second, in addition to the local jail system, LA County is home to state and federal prisons and juvenile camps, as well as immigrant detention centers. So LA is a very rich place to talk about the multiple forms of incarceration, or what I call human caging, in the United States. Third, Los Angeles is home to large communities of some of the most disparately policed and incarcerated populations in the United States. LA has the largest Black community anywhere in the American West. We have the largest Mexican community living anywhere north of the US-Mexico border, and we have the largest urban Indian community anywhere in the United States, and we have one of the largest houseless populations anywhere in the United States. So if we want to talk about the many communities that are being policed and incarcerated in the United States, we can talk about it in Los Angeles, and again, from Los Angeles. And finally, Los Angeles is a Western story. This is important because when we talk about the history or the historiography of mass incarceration in the United States, largely we focus on the American South and the urban North. But what I really want to lay out today is that the American West has a story to tell, and that story matters for all of us. Now, finding the LA story was extraordinarily difficult. The Los Angeles Police Department has destroyed the vast majority of their historical records. In fact, only 4 boxes remain. But as I quickly learned, the people who fought the rise of incarceration in Los Angeles left a steady stream of records behind within Los Angeles, across the country, and in fact, around the world. I call the records that they left behind a rebel archive. They survived police destruction, and they were authored by and about the people who fought the rise of mass incarceration. Comprised mostly of broken locks, of secret codes, of handbills, of manifestos, and of love songs. This rebel archive survived against all of the odds, survived a project of elimination in the archives. But the Rebel Archive also thunders in plain sight. If you're looking carefully, you can find it in the United States Congress and rulings made before the United States Supreme Court, and in 2 of the most significant uprisings to strike the North American continent, the 1910 Mexican Revolution and the 1965 Watts Uprising. So what I did is I collected up every song, every ruling, every strike I could find, and in the end, the Rebel Archive held more than enough evidence for me to write 6 stories that span 2 centuries of incarceration in and from Los Angeles. What I want to do now is I want to just sort of very briefly overview for you all the 6 stories that I tell in City of Inmates, and then we'll pull it all together with this new conceptual understanding that I want to put forward for mass incarceration. So the first story that I tell in City of Inmates is about the birth of imprisonment in Los Angeles, and it chronicles the rise of the city's very first carceral trend. And that's the imprisonment of the region's indigenous communities, which are today variously known as Tongva, Gabrielino, and Kish nations. Native imprisonment, namely on vagrancy charges and public drunkenness and public disorder charges, dominated the story of incarceration between the Spanish colonial period through the Mexican national period and into the early years of US rule. Those early years of US rule are about 1850 to the early 1880s. But by 1880, about 3 decades into US rule, Native imprisonment declined and a second carceral trend began. That trend was one of the most surprising trends that I found in the archive, the rebel archive. That's the imprisonment of poor white men, namely vagrants, especially itinerants. And poor white men, believe it or not, comprise nearly 100% of the imprisoned populations in Los Angeles and across the American West at the turn of the 20th century. That's a story I didn't expect to find. The third story I tell in City of Inmates is about the invention of immigrant detention as a new form of human caging in the United States. Created by the United States Supreme Court on May 17th of 1896, on the very same day that the court made its infamous ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, and created amid a movement to purge Chinese immigrants from the American West, immigrant detention was then an obscure and a very contested practice of indisputably racist origins. It is now one of the most dynamic sectors of the US carceral landscape. So, the third story is about the invention of immigrant detention. The fourth story traces how the imprisonment of Mexicans in Los Angeles and across the US-Mexico borderlands first surged during the era of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. So here we're bringing back the origin story of Mexican imprisonment in the United States to a moment of revolution in Mexico. The fifth story that I tell in City of Inmates is also largely about Mexican imprisonment in the United States, and what it does is it documents when, why, how, and with what consequence entering the United States without authorization became a crime in the year 1929. This is a story about how efforts to keep Mexican immigrants out of the United States led to the imprisonment of Mexican immigrants within the United States. And in fact, this is a story that I'm going to take you all a little bit more deeply into in a few minutes. Now, the final story that I tell in City of Inmates, the final story that was given to me by this rebel archive, is one that we cannot go without when we talk about the rise of mass incarceration in the United States. And that's about how Black incarceration in Los Angeles shot from politically irrelevant and just slightly disproportionate in the year 1900 to politically dominant, stunningly disproportionate, and chronically lethal by the 1920s. It has remained so ever since. This is a particularly brutal history, recorded through the first killing of a young Black man by the LAPD in April of 1927. But it is also a history of persistent and indeed, in time, explosive Black rebellion in the belly of the city, closing with the outbreak of the 1965 Watts Rebellion. So this final story really lifts up the tangled relationship between police brutality, mass incarceration, and Black rebellion in Los Angeles. Now, some of you might be struggling right now, and I was struggling too when I first pulled all of these stories out of the Rebel Archive. How do these scattered histories fit together? They range from the Spanish colonial period to the 1965 Watts Uprising. They address issues from vagrancy laws to immigration control to police brutality, and they churn through a variety of communities at particular moments in time. But as I pulled one story and then another from the Rebel Archive, I soon began to see how they line up on the arc of time when we're looking through the optic of conquest and in particular, settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism is like the new race, class, and gender trilogy of scholarship. So let me explain what that is and how I use this particular concept. While I do that, while I explain how I use settler colonialism, I invite you just to watch this video about land conquest in the United States. Okay, so the United States is a settler state. Settler colonialism is a strain of colonization that is not organized around resource extraction or labor exploitation. Resource extraction, such as mining, and labor exploitation, such as chattel slavery, absolutely occur within settler colonial contexts and can be critical to their development. But settler colonial projects seek land. On that land, the settlers envisioned building a new, a permanent, a reproductive, and a racially exclusive society. Indeed, what makes settlers is that settlers invade in order to stay and reproduce, while working to remove, to dominate, and ultimately replace indigenous communities with a racially homogeneous and a sexually reproductive society. In other words, eliminating indigenous communities and disappearing racialized outsiders, as well as non-reproductive so-called sexual deviants, is the basic thrust of social relations and institutional practices in settler societies such as the United States, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and so on. Now, this settler variant of conquest runs particularly strong in the American West. And as I argue in City of Inmates, the dynamics of constructing a white, Christian, heteronormative settler society drove the rise of incarceration as an evolving system of indigenous elimination and racial disappearance in the city. It began with the criminalization and the caging up of the region's indigenous communities. Next, the settlers criminalized and caged thousands upon thousands of poor white men who migrated constantly, lived in homosocial communities, and who loved in homosexual ways. These white men either would not or could not abide by Anglo-American settler norms of heading nuclear families, acquiring native land, or permanently settling down. So the settler authorities criminalized them, and they caged them up. Then, with the passage of a series of carcerally inflected immigration laws, settlers in Los Angeles, across the American West, and yes, in the United States Congress, attempted to deny Chinese immigrants the right to enter the settler-claimed territory, while later allowing Mexican immigrants to enter the territory, but to not settle permanently north of the US-Mexico border. Both the invention of immigrant detention in the year 1896 and the criminalization of unlawful entry in 1929 developed amid these unambiguous attempts to stop humans defined as non-white from making homes in the United States a white settler society. At the opening of the 20th century, when large numbers of African American citizens moved west, free and on their own terms, and in defiance of the vision of manifest destiny, the response was swift and brutal as city authorities created the conditions for criminalizing, caging, expelling, mauling, and outright murdering Black citizens. And amid all of this, between the caging of Tongva Gabrielino communities and the killing of Black citizens, the Magonistas, a band of political dissidents from Mexico, crossed the US-Mexico border, threatening to oust Mexico's president, Porfirio Diaz, to end white supremacy and to restore indigenous and communal land claims. If the rebels were to succeed in Mexico, their uprising would not only upend US capital investments in Mexico, remember that Mexico was the first site of US imperialism, but it would quite possibly ripple north, wreaking havoc for white supremacy and the enduring but the always precarious occupation of indigenous lands and lives north of the US-Mexico border. So US and Mexican authorities in the early 20th century, including the LAPD and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, hunted the rebels down, arresting thousands upon thousands of so-called malos mexicanos, bad Mexicans, across the US-Mexico borderlands. In August of 1907, they kicked in the door of a shanty on the edge of Los Angeles and arrested the rebellion's leaders, a man in particular by the name of Ricardo Flores Magón. Although sent to solitary confinement in the Los Angeles County Jail, Magón smuggled out letters and manifestos and plans to raid Mexico. All of this, which continued to prod the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution from the LA County Jail in 1910. Now, when chronicled like this, when you put the pieces of the story together, these different communities at different moments in time, and these different tactics of the carceral state, these stories saved by the rebel archive taught me that from the very first days of US rule in Los Angeles, i.e. the Tongva Basin, incarceration has persistently operated as a means of purging, of removing, of caging, of containing, of erasing, of disappearing, and of otherwise eliminating indigenous communities and racialized outsiders. Labor exploitation was constant. White supremacy is always. But the punchline across time, across community, and across tactic is that mass incarceration is indeed mass elimination. That is what the Rebel Archive taught me in and from Los Angeles. So now with this lesson learned, that mass incarceration is in fact mass elimination, I want to take you a little bit more deeply into one of the stories that I tell in City of Inmates that in particular is about the intersection of immigration control and mass incarceration on stolen lands. That story is about the criminalization of unlawful entry in 1929. This story begins with the rise of Mexican immigration to the United States in the early 20th century. So in the year 1900, very few Mexicans lived in the United States, only about 100,000. By the year 1930, 10% of the population of Mexico lived north of the US-Mexico border, about 1.5 million people. As Mexican immigration surged during the early 20th century, many in the United States Congress, in fact, were trying to transform US immigration law into a whites-only immigration policy. What they did is they banned all Asian immigration to the United States, and they cut the number of immigrants allowed to enter the country from anywhere other than Northern and Western Europe. But whenever Congress tried to place a cap on the number of Mexicans allowed to enter the country every year, employers across the American Southwest would rise up in protest. US employers in the region had eagerly stoked the rise of Mexican immigration. By the 1920s, Western farmers and railroad industrialists and many others were absolutely dependent upon Mexican workers. However, and this is a key, Western employers had no vision, no plan for Mexican immigrants to ever become Mexican Americans or US citizens. As one agribusiness lobbyist, S. Parker Fussell, put it in 1926, quote, "The Mexican is a homer. Like the pigeon, he goes home to roost." On Fussell's promise that Mexicans were, quote, "not immigrants, but rather, in his words, birds of passage," Western employers did successfully defeat proposals to cap Mexican immigration to the United States during the 1920s. Yet, by the close of the 1920s, Mexicans, in fact, were settling north of the US-Mexico border. They bought homes, they started families, and they raised a new generation of Mexican-American children. And here are just some images from the Los Angeles area during the 1920s of Mexicans making full and vibrant lives for themselves north of the border. They're having religious ceremonies, they're going to the beach and they're hanging out, and in fact, they're even burying their dead north of the border. Now, monitoring this rise of full and vibrant Mexican-American communities in southwestern states, the advocates of a whites-only immigration system charged Western employers with recklessly courting Anglo-America's racial doom at our southern border. Does that sound familiar at all to you all? Western employers agreed that Mexicans should not be allowed to become US citizens, but they also wanted unfettered access to Mexican workers. "We need the labor," they would roar back at the restrictionists in Congress. Now, it's amid this escalating conflict between nativists in Congress and the business people in the American West that a senator from Dixie, from the American South, proposed a compromise. Senator Coleman Livingston hailed from the hills of South Carolina. In 1925, he entered the United States Congress committed above all else to protecting white supremacy. I have to be very clear about Senator Blease. Very few people during the 1920s, public officials, would publicly declare their support of lynching. Blease was one of the few who did so, and he did it from the floor of the United States Congress. In 1929, as immigration restrictionists in Congress and employers in the Southwest tussled over the future of Mexican immigration to the United States, it was Blease who proposed the way forward. Now, how did he do this? According to US immigration officials, Mexicans made 1 million authorized, lawful border crossings into the United States during the 1920s. To do so, what that meant is that they arrived at a port of entry, they paid an entry fee, and they submitted to any required tests, such as a literacy test and a health exam. However, as US immigration authorities reported, many other Mexican immigrants did not lawfully enter the United States or register for legal entry. They informally crossed the border at will. Now, why would they do that? A lot of reasons. One, why would you walk 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles down the road so you could cross the border through a port of entry. That's one. Two, the entry fees were prohibitively high for Mexican immigrants in the 1920s. And three, many Mexican immigrants were subjected to gasoline baths at the ports of entry. So why would you subject yourselves to these conditions? So people crossed the border informally. In Congress, when the debate stalled over how many Mexicans to allow in each of year through those ports of entry, what Blease did is he shifted attention to stopping the large number of border crossings that took place outside of the formal ports of entry. And he suggested criminalizing unmonitored entry into the United States. According to Blease's bill, as you see here, unlawfully entering the United States would be a misdemeanor, while returning to the United States after deportation would be a felony. The idea was to force Mexican immigrants into a stream, authorized stream that could be turned on and turned off at will at the ports of entry. Any immigrant who entered the United States informally would be a criminal and subject to fines, imprisonment, and ultimately deportation. But let's be very clear. The congressional testimony on this is clear. This is a crime that was designed to impact Mexican immigrants in particular. The racial animus is baked into this law. Neither the agribusinessmen nor the restrictionists registered any objections. Congress passed Blease's bill, the Immigration Act of March 4th, 1929, and this dramatically altered the story of race and incarceration in the United States. With stunning precision, the criminalization of unauthorized entry caged thousands upon thousands of Mexico's proverbial birds of passage. Within 1 year, U.S. attorneys prosecuted more than 7,000 cases. By the end of the 1930s, they had prosecuted more than 44,000 cases. Mexicans never comprised fewer than 85% of all the people prosecuted for unlawful entry. Some years, Mexicans comprised more than 99% of the people prosecuted for unlawful entry. What this meant is that by the end of the 1930s, tens of thousands of Mexicans had been arrested, charged, prosecuted, and imprisoned for unlawfully entering the United States. One of the issues was that until 1930, the US federal penal system was very, very small. Here you see these are the three major prisons that we had in the United States, federal prisons, prior to 1930, and there are no federal prisons in the US-Mexico border region. To cage Mexico's birds of passage, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons had to build a string of new facilities along the U.S.-Mexico border. That first facility that the Bureau built was La Tuna, a federal prison located just north of El Paso, Texas. And I should let you know, La Tuna is still in operation. Opened in April of 1932, La Tuna was a sprawling prison farm with a maximum capacity of 420 persons. Within just 3 months of opening, it was full beyond capacity. So leaders at the U.S. Bureau of Prisons searched for a, quote, sufficiently isolated place to camp some more of our Mexican friends, end quote. They chose a site at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains and named the roughshod convict labor facility after the nearest town, Tucson Prison Camp number 10. Here's a picture of La Tuna. And here you're watching the expansion of the carceral state as a simple reflection to Blease's law. Opened in the summer of 1933, Tucson Prison Camp number 10 was a minimum security convict labor camp where prisoners built a road up, through, and across the mountains to a little town called Oracle. There in Oracle, settlers in Arizona hoped to build a health resort that would provide them with cool sanctuary from the region's sweltering summers. Road work progressed at Tucson, but the warden complained, and a warden who had worked in Alabama just prior to coming to Arizona. He complained about the camp's high escape rate. The men imprisoned at Tucson, as the warden put it, were, quote, young Mexicans with very few brains, if any. But I would argue that the archival record suggests that it was a very intelligent assessment of camp conditions that led to the high number of escapes from Tucson Prison Camp number 10. Building the road to Oracle was extremely dangerous. There were 2 deaths and multiple injuries just within the first year of operation. And again, the warden Gaffney, a man with experience in the Southern penal system, handed out extraordinarily harsh punishments. One of those punishments that he handed out was a box that he was familiar with in the Southern penal system. It was called the hole. It stood about yay high, right? And you get inside of it and they lock you in for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. You have to urinate on yourself, defecate on yourself, and stay within that box for days on end. He did not have a box in Tucson, so what did Warden Gaffney do? He walked out into the desert, he dug a hole, and he dropped people in the hole and then put a steel grate on top of it, and he baked them in the desert. That was the hole at Tucson Prison Camp, number 10. So guess what? People ran away every time they got a chance. If you go to the Federal Bureau of Prisons records in College Park, Maryland, you'll find these envelopes that are stuffed with stacks of these escapee cards from Tucson Prison Camp, number 10. Now, despite the establishment of La Tuna in 1932 and Tucson Prison Camp in 1933, the Federal Bureau of Prisons still faced a carceral capacity crisis, in particular in Southern California. Without any federal prison in Southern California, all immigrants charged and or convicted of unlawful entry in the region were held in county jails, namely the Los Angeles County Jail, or transferred to La Tuna or Tucson Prison Camp, number 10, to serve their time. So in 1938, the Bureau of Prisons opened one last federal detention and imprisonment facility for Mexico's so-called birds of passage, and that's Terminal Island Prison, which is still in operation today in Los Angeles County. Therefore, by the end of the 1930s, the criminalization of unlawful entry and re-entry had bulged the federal penal system and tipped its expansion from El Paso to Los Angeles. As intended, Mexicans comprised the overwhelming majority of immigration offenders, having agreed upon nothing but the need to control Mexican settlement north of the border. The nervous nativists and the Western employers of the tribal 20s, the 1920s, had made a carceral compromise to confine Mexican migration to authorized and presumably controllable pathways. In capturing Mexico's birds of passage, those who dared to violate the negotiated terms of managed entry, Mexican imprisonment boomed across the borderlands, established the first federal prison in Los Angeles, and filled it with Mexicans who, after a term of incarceration, would be deported, forcibly removed from the settler state. In other words, the rise of Mexican imprisonment across the borderlands during the 1930s was a story of immigration control in a settler society. And it remains so today. In fact, Blease's law remains the law of the land. Today we call it Section 1325 and 1326 of the US Code. And Blease's law is sending more people to federal prison today than any other charge category in the United States. And those being imprisoned and then deported are disproportionately non-white and non-Christian immigrants. In other words, Blease's law lives. It is an invention of the settler state during the 1920s, and it continues to marshal criminalization and incarceration to achieve racially targeted outcomes of U.S. immigration control. Thank you very much.